I see some differences, for example, in the story with Moses, where we've got Pharaoh, who represents Egypt, this huge superpower on the planet, coming against God's desire. And here you have it's a tale between two men, both ostensibly men of God, but one who's lost God's favor and the other one who retains God's favor. And so it's two humans. So the disagreement between them feels a lot more personal, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because all it's like it's family fighting, and that doesn't. And I guess the thing that I would ask somebody like Saul, well, granted that I was in this place where he wouldn't kill me if I asked the question, right? It'd be like Saul. So your first fear, where David's going to get the kingdom. What's wrong with
Yeah.
that? If it's good for the kingdom and it's good for your family, and God deems it that it's what He wants, what's wrong with that? Isn't that what you want too? And the fact that I think his answer would be no tells
No.
us everything we need to know about where Saul ended up.
So, Jeremiah, here we go again, and we're talking today about the story of God and David as we continue our journey in exploring the great themes of the Old Testament and what they have to teach us about God, who He is, and what He wants for our life. And honestly, it's been such a great, fun journey to walk through these different people's lives and their interaction with God, Adam and Eve, and Noah, and Moses, and Abraham. And we are now at the point in our story where God raises up a king, a man named David. And we've covered a lot of different stories in a lot of different places. And I guess I have a question for you. As we've talked about these stories, do you feel like they're true? Like, I know you often say, oh, that's so wild. But where do you stand in reconciling or believing the details of these stories?
That's a great question, and I think it moves around as I've aged. I think the Genesis to me is it was definitely written in a poetic style, right? The style of storytelling that exists in Genesis seems to be very different than what exists elsewhere in the Old Testament. I also think the story is so big and so vast, and it was communicating the origin story to people who had no concept of science or didn't have a concept of science yet. Um, I think Genesis? I'm very much like, hey, I think all the points are true, and I think that is it 100% accurate telling of what happened? I have no idea. No idea. I don't know. Beyond that, I think it's very literal. I think Exodus is Exodus. I think Noah, possibly was it a regional flood versus a worldwide flood? I don't know. I think the point of the story is true. Um, and I guess the question that I would ask you or anyone else in return, if you found out that maybe, let's say the flood, for example, was a regional flood versus a worldwide flood, would that change your opinion of God or the story? For me, it wouldn't.
No, it wouldn't. No.
So I think that's where it's like, why get caught up on some of this stuff? I believe that the big picture of we made decisions to separate ourselves from God, and God started this epic story of thousands of years to bring us back into redemption with Him, to
Yeah.
redeem us in His sight. And I think that's 100% true.
Can you see how the thread is continuing, how the story continues to unfold in now kind of a more familiar way? Like when we started and we were talking about raising Noah up, for example, after Adam and Eve, we maybe didn't know how the whole story was going to fall together, but now we're far enough along. We've covered centuries of time where we can see the consistency in this story, and we see God's intent, his focus on getting the job done, on getting us to the point of redemption, to restore His people to Himself. And that's what makes the story so fantastic, in my opinion. Less about the details and more about how God, He never gave up, and He never gave up on us.
Yeah, the things that I'll take away from the series always would be one, I like your idea of funneling, right? He's
Yeah,
continuing to funneling these stories down ultimately to Jesus, ultimately to our redemption, right?
right.
Um, I love his chosen people. I love the idea of how he's working all of these things together. And also, I love the idea, or it's really stood out to me, of how little we need to bring to the table for him to work with us, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, Ordinary men doing extraordinary things is a phrase that I've heard you say many times of God is just using ordinary men. Now, Noah, there's definitely some things that seems unordinary about that story, but Moses seemed many times very just, yeah, I get you. I love how he was like, I'm not going back to Egypt, right? Um,
Yeah. Well,
I
he had his reasons, right? He's like, oh no, I remember that guy I killed 40 years
yeah,
ago. They probably remember that too.
absolutely. Like he's that's very understandable, and still look at what how God used these folks, right?
Yeah.
And I
Hmm.
love the supporting cast of characters in these stories. Like David today has my
Yeah.
all-time favorite character in all of scripture, and that's Jonathan, right? Like Jonathan is
Yeah.
just awesome. I love this guy. Um,
I,
and I was just going to say that it's interesting to me of, the idea of reading ourselves in the story of, like, not only do the main characters, not only does David have a lot to teach us about how to be God and how he cares for us, but all the supporting cast teaches us a lot as well.
yeah. Well, let's get into the story. We're really talking about David's journey from being a shepherd boy to a king. Again, another remarkable story, as all of these men's stories have truly been remarkable. And it really does showcase to us God's ability to take an ordinary person and make that person instrumental in fulfilling his promises to us. So now this story takes place about between 200 and 400 years after the Exodus. As we
Okay.
talked about, there isn't a specific date for the Exodus. So it's in the 10th century BC. And so that's where we're at in our timeline. You know how much I like to keep track of the timeline. Um, David is born in the town of Bethlehem, which is incredibly important to us because, as we see later, Jesus is born in the same time, in the same town. So David begins his life as a shepherd, and he is apparently very good at this job. And he was the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons. And his brothers were stronger. They were more impressive outwardly. We kind of get this picture of the brothers being a little more he-man and perhaps David being a little bit more slight of character. God saw something very deep in David, and what he really saw was David's heart. So, among all these brothers, Jesse's sons, God chooses David to become anointed by the prophet Samuel. And Samuel is the prophet who anoints Saul, he anoints David, and he anoints Solomon. So he's very much intertwined with the stories of these three kings. And this anointing was done when David was really a very young boy. He's only 15 years old, and it's done in secret. So let's walk through why that was done at all. Now, at this particular point, Saul is the king, and he had been chosen king by God. He had been elected, or not elected, elected by God to be the king of the people. So what's happening here that all of a sudden there's this secret meeting and the little shepherd boy gets anointed?
I mean, it feels a little bit like a coup, right?
A God coup?
Yeah, yeah. God's like, we got to make a switch here. Hot swap is what the phrase
Yeah.
of the year, right?
Oh, is that the phrase of the year? I don't even know what that means, but okay. So we do this hot swap. Why does he want to swap out Saul for David? What's the
I mean,
problem?
Saul. Well, Saul. Well, it's interesting from the beginning. Of God said that these kings aren't going to be good for you. Then he chose Saul,
Right.
and then it turned out that these kings aren't good for you. Right now, David is
Mm-hmm.
another king, so he still makes mistakes. Saul got incredibly jealous of David after David killed Goliath, and just the populist movement inside. of the kingdom was all excited for David. How could they not be? There was this standoff for what, 40 days, and David ended it, right, with
Yes.
this little boy that came out and took out this inconceivable giant. That is the stuff of fairy tales, right? And so Saul heard this song that was going on, and he got very angry and decided he was going to somehow go off and kill David. And then later on, God gave him a couple commands, specifically of kill the, was it Amalekites? Is that how you say it? Um,
Amalekites. Close. You could just say it
and
with conviction and nobody will know.
Conviction, yeah.
So,
God went off to, there was a battle, and he said, "Hey, I need you to kill everybody. Don't take anything." And Saul was like, "How about I only follow half of that?" So he's proving that he's jealous. He's suffering from the symptoms of everybody, of a lot of other people in these stories. Of he knows best. He's going to be God in his mind, and he's jealous of other people.
yeah. Well, okay. Well, let's add some context to what you just shared with us. We've got this
Okay.
situation happening between Saul and this young person. This young person, David, is anointed by God, and then there's this epic event around 1020. The Philistines, they are sending out their champion Goliath, and he's taunting the people of Israel, the armies. And David, he's delivering sandwiches, right? Well, here's your sandwich, delivering supplies to his brothers.
DoorDash.
And he hears what Goliath is doing, and he's like, "Oh, that I don't really like that guy." So he becomes filled with righteous anger. That's what 1 Samuel 17 tells us. And he steps in and goes, "Well, I'll fight the dude. I'll do it." And I'm sure they're all laughing because he's slight of character and he's not really a warrior. But to your point, as you said, he takes the sling with one rock. He hits the guy right between the eyes, hits Goliath between the eyes, and that's it. He's out. So this striking Goliath with a rock and a sling really just points to that this victory comes through God's power. And even David says so, right? He says, the
Mm-hmm.
battle is the Lord's. So we see this idea that, David is already, has the favor of God, and he's already giving all of the credit to God, and God is pleased by this. He's already been anointed. But this is just another, I think, indication or, understanding that he is going to be, he's going to be in a relationship with God throughout this whole thing. And again, God is looking at the heart. So while Saul was the people's choice, David was God's choice. Now, Saul was initially very excited about David, but as you said, it became an issue of being jealous of power, which is kind of weird because he's still a young man and Saul has all the power. But he can't get out of his own way. He just is convinced that this guy is going to take over. And honestly, I mean, he was right. He did take over, right?
He did take over,
Uh,
and Saul made moves to make it happen, actually.
yeah. Well, Saul did have his son, Jonathan, one of his
Mm-hmm.
sons. And this is a relationship that you very much like. So walk us through this relationship between David and Jonathan. What is it that you see is so special or endearing about this relationship?
So I like just the idea, I think any human does, of just two people that are close friends, right? Like that's just
Yeah.
cool. We all want that. That's fun. The idea of Jonathan that he would do the right thing. Again, the next right move. He's very he displays that character consistently throughout the story of where it came to a head of um, I love my favorite story, probably top five stories in the entire Bible, is the idea of Jonathan was in a camp with Saul, and there
Right.
was Philistines again on the high ground, right? And Saul was stuck down there. Seems to be a theme of Saul's campaigns, from what we can see. And David grabbed his sword. Sorry, Jonathan grabbed his sword bearer and said, "Hey," and this in the middle of the night, "perhaps the Lord will bless us." not like, hey, I've got some clear calling from God. Like, perhaps the Lord will bless us. He climbs up the back of the mountain with his sword bearer, strikes him in the middle of the night. They don't know what's going on. They fight each other and run away. I love the idea of Jonathan, if he's the perhaps guy, the perhaps the Lord will bless us. Then you see of how he had his loyalty to his father later on, um, but his loyalty to David. So he really navigated it quite well. Like the whole story of the arrows, right? Like Dave's like, I think your dad's trying to kill me. Jonathan's like, no, he's not. It's cool. It's cool. Let me go figure it out. And I'm going to send my servant out. And he has this whole elaborate thing to communicate to David. Like, he didn't really betray his father, and he took care of his friend, but he stayed
Yeah.
by his father's side through the end. And so I think ultimately he was killed in battle.
He was killed in battle. Like Saul killed himself in battle when he realized that he was not going to survive it, and then his sons were killed, but Jonathan was killed by one of Saul's own warriors, which
Okay.
made David very mad because he did not want Jonathan killed. He did not want it to happen that way because he did not want to take the matter into his own hands. He wanted God to, he wanted to honor God's selection of Saul as the king. So, but throughout the story with Jonathan and David, you do see this close bond, this wonderful friendship. And it wouldn't have been easy for Jonathan trying to figure out what camp do I put myself in.
Mm-hmm.
But I love that he was a friend to David the whole time. Throughout this warrior period of David's life, we see this shifting favor, as you're speaking to the fact that, Saul just isn't quite as obedient, is he? Like, he's not necessarily attending to every detail that God is asking him to attend to. He's kind of doing it. He's kind of killing the Amalekites.
Mm-hmm.
And because of his inability to follow God's directive down to the detail to kill everybody and not take all their property, something really terrible happens, which is that the Spirit of God departs from him. And I feel like that's very dramatic language to think that God was with Saul for all this period, but we see this again shifting favor where now he's lost the favor of God. And obviously, when that happens, I think you're at a bit of a tough spot at that point.
Yeah, I could imagine either case, right? Like, you're a king, you have the favor of God, and then but there's a couple moments that are bizarre where it's like God sent an evil spirit upon him. I don't understand how that all that works. Like, being in God's favor, not being in God's favor. Like, if Saul would to come back, like, and ask for forgiveness about the Amalekites and gone into mourning, how would have God recognized that? I think throughout
Yeah.
the story we see a consistency that Saul is about Saul. Saul
Yeah.
likes his power, and
He
Saul
doesn't seem to
likes
he
him.
doesn't seem to care how it's impacting his relationship with God.
Or
Um,
his family, right? Because with
yeah.
Jonathan and his daughter, who's David's wife, she had to
Hmm.
save David from Saul trying to come kill him. Like, this
Yeah.
is everybody he allegedly loves and cares for. His ego is too large and just destroying everything.
Yeah, I see some differences, for example, in the story with Moses, where we've got Pharaoh, who represents Egypt, this huge superpower on the planet, coming against God's desire. And here you have it's a tale between two men, both ostensibly men of God, but one who's lost God's favor and the other one who retains God's favor. And so it's two humans, so the disagreement between them feels a lot more personal, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because all it's like it's family fighting, and that doesn't. And I guess the thing that I would ask somebody like Saul, well, granted that I was in a place where he wouldn't kill me if I asked the question, right? It'd be like, Saul, so your first fear where David's going to get the kingdom. What's wrong with
Yeah.
that? If it's good for the kingdom and it's good for your family, and God deems it that it's what He wants, What's wrong with that? Isn't that what you want too? And the fact that I think his answer would be no tells
No.
us everything we need to know about where Saul ended up.
Well, these dynasties that come forward over the next many centuries, as you see in the Bible, these kings and people of power create a family dynasty, and they want their family to retain power. It's no different with Saul. He wants his power to go to his kids, not some outsider who was the shepherd. He just doesn't see
Mm-hmm.
why would that be God's choice over him. But God again wants a king that's going to be what the people want, a king, and also what he wants, a king who's going to live under God's rule. That's what he wants. It's pretty simple. So when Saul stops doing that, he shifts the favor to David. And after Saul dies in 1004 BC or so, David is anointed king of Judah. And he's about 30 years old at this time. So he's had 15 years, right, of interacting with Saul and the family and being a warrior and serving Saul's reign and staying loyal to Saul when he didn't necessarily have to, but that loyalty really was loyalty to God, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, David could have easily led a coup against him of his own accord, and he didn't.
Yeah, he could have. And it really shows a lot of restraint. It shows a lot of restraint and humility that, once again, this man is waiting on God's timing. He's not taking it into his own hands, but surely he could have. You
15
have to
years,
wonder.
which is,
Yeah,
if you want any power, 15 years is a long time to wait for it.
right. We think of this time as, I don't know, we read these stories and we think, oh, a few years later he became king. No, there's a long periods of time here where people are just living out their lives, right? And God is
Mm-hmm.
working ahead of them. And he's preparing what is to happen next. And what happens next is that in another 7 years or so, he becomes the first king over all of Israel. And this is pretty significant. This is detailed in 2 Samuel. So at 37 years old, he's the king of the United Kingdom of Israel. The entire country, for the first time, moves away from tribes and judges to one king, King David. Monumental. And of course, the Jewish people have high reverence for David and the fact that he was able really to usher in the golden age of Israel, if you will, by establishing a kingdom. And David chooses Jerusalem as his capital, and he goes there and he brings to Jerusalem the Ark of the Covenant, and this makes Jerusalem the spiritual capital of Israel. So God, David are united in their effort, and they're establishing Jerusalem as the center of the nation of Israel's power, which I think it's a beautiful thing. Yeah. So fast forward again a period of time to around 1990. Jerusalem is growing, the kingdom is thriving. There's still war happening as David is out there banishing all the tribes or the enemies of God. He's a warring king. He's trying to clear the land and unite the people, which he's doing well. And God provides him with a covenant. We've seen these covenants before. Here's our next covenant. Like the last covenant with Moses was really about saving the people and establishing a people group for himself. And what was the sign that people would be the people of God? The sign was circumcision.
Oh, yes,
You
yes.
probably
Oh, okay,
forgot
sorry.
that.
I thought, yeah, I tried to block that from my mind. No, I thought we were
Right.
talking about David. Sorry, I got confused.
I'm sorry, I'm talking about Moses. How in the last covenant, our last covenant was with Moses, and God creates this covenant with Moses saying that you will be my people, I will be your God, And the sign of you being a person of God is the circumcision. And then he also provides them with what is needed in terms of all the commandments and all the rules about how to establish a society. So now we come to the covenant that's called the royal covenant. And this is a covenant with one person. And he promises David the fact that his throne, the King David's throne, would be established forever. So basically, what's he doing with David? What is this covenant really about?
His covenant is about that he is going to be the line of which Jesus is born from,
Right.
the ultimate king.
Yeah. So he's saying the lineage has to come from somebody, right? Because they're people. And so I'm going to choose your seed, your lineage, by which I will bring forth the ultimate king of Israel, and he will always be a king. So God declares to David and says, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So it establishes David's continuation, the continuation of his dynasty, but of course it points to the coming of Christ. So David realizes that his dynasty will live forever. Yeah. It's quite a gift to give to David. Quite a gift.
Absolutely. And I love like little details of the story of at one point David, there, Saul's trying to kill him, and he was in that dinner, and they said that David had to go to Bethlehem to be with his family. It's like, oh, I know that place.
Yeah. Well, it does remind us of why during the nativity story, when we hear these themes about Jesus being born in Bethlehem or Jesus being born a king, not that he would become a king, but he was born a king, that here is the genesis of that. This is where it comes from. The fact that he's born in the same place that David was, and the fact that God gave him this enduring royal covenant, this dynasty of David's family. So we're seeing how God is bringing his promises to fruition. And I love that. I love how no matter what the circumstances, God finds a way. And we know that David's certainly not a perfect person, right? He has a very close relationship with God, but once again, he's not without sin.
Absolutely.
And David's sin is on full display in what happens next around 980 BC. So what happened with this story? How is his sin on display to us?
Well, he finds a woman that he's quite fond of, right? And there's a problem that this woman's already married, and married to one of David's military commanders, perhaps a general. I don't quite know the language of what he was called. And David set it up so this guy was killed in battle. Like, hey, put him at the front of the line, everybody charge him, and everybody fall back, and what's going to happen to this guy? And I think this is after David actually took advantage of Bathsheba, right? I don't quite remember the order, but I think David saw her, took advantage of her, and then had her husband killed.
Right.
And it wrecked David's family. I mean, David never fully recovered from it, because I believe there's this weird tension of our actions have consequences, and God still has a plan and still uses us, right?
Absolutely. Like the sequence of events this is kind of interesting as I was walking through this. He is in Jerusalem. His troops are out. David's troops are all out in battle. So he's kind of on his own with perhaps...
Which is already a bad move.
Yeah, he has unstructured time on his hands, and normally we don't see that, but he does. And there he's on his balcony in the city of David, which he has now built, which exists today. It's an archaeological site in Jerusalem. It's absolutely fascinating what they're finding there in the city that David built. And it sits up high on a terrace, and from where his palace is, you can see many rooftops, and he sees this woman bathing, Bathsheba, out on the rooftop, which is par for the course. It's not like she's doing this to be noticed. And he's taken with her. So he's the king, and he summons her to his house. And the text tells us that he takes her. In the Hebrew word, the word there is that he takes her. And we see it translated in our versions as he lays with her. Of course, implying that they had sexual relationships, but also, I think, potentially that he raped her. That
Right.
this was something that he did, not necessarily with her consent, but what choice did she have? She's just a woman.
He's the king.
He's the king.
You can't say no.
Yeah. So that's definitely part of the sinful nature. Not that they're having an affair, which is true, and that it's an adulterous affair, but he's also committing a sinful act against her. He's putting her in a terrible position, which he did.
Mm-hmm.
And she becomes pregnant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you have this moment where he's like, uh-oh, now what? Let's send for Uriah to come back, and Uriah will sleep with her most certainly, and we could cover it up because we'll just say it's Uriah's baby. But Uriah's, he's too much of a soldier to do that, right? Instead, he comes
he's a good
back.
man, and he stays
He's a good man.
outside because his soldiers would.
Exactly. He's like, hey, I can't have something that's a benefit to me that my soldiers don't get. Because I like the fact that the guy had a lot of stand-up character in this whole thing. And he is right there aligned with his troops. But this just makes David mad, right? Like, oh my gosh, I can't get what I want, which is for him to sleep with his wife. So now I have to do it a different way. And he orders this horrible, act of putting him right there in the front lines.
Essentially executes him at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's just not good, is it?
No, I go back to God foretold all this was going to happen when people wanted a king. And even the idea back to the garden of knowledge, right? We appear unable to deal with knowledge and power. It corrupts everybody, even somebody that is it seems as strong as David. It corrupted him to a point, right? It seemed like he did ask for repentance after a counselor came to him, and so there is that moment where he's not Saul. He doesn't quadruple down on it, but I think that go back to the beginning. You're in my town. I'm the king. Here's this thing that I want. Life, David forgot his place, right? That he's a servant of God, and he got thought too lofty of himself and committed, a pretty foul thing. Like, it is one of the worst things that he could have done outside of like a genocide. I mean, because you think Bathsheba had to live with this forever, knowing that the guy that killed her husband, that took her of not her own accord, is the father of her child. Like, that's just a mess that can never be undone.
Well, that child is taken from them, the child they conceived, and God actually tells him, Nathan tells David, God is going to take your child. And this is exactly what happens. The child dies, and it's this hugely mournful situation for David when he realizes the consequences of his action. And in this case, we're really talking about divine justice, like this idea that God specifically goes in and says, because of what you did, I'm going to take your son away from you. And I just think that feels so personally difficult to, I don't know, it just feels so personally difficult for Bathsheba, who really wasn't her fault, and then for David. But the question is God still delivering divine justice? Is that still happening to people today?
I don't know, and I'd probably default on the side of like, I kind of hope not, because We're
You don't
all
want
guilty.
justice. You don't want God
I mean, I
to
want justice
deliver.
against all the bad people that are not me, right?
I see. So you want justice
Um,
delivered in a certain way at a certain time to certain people.
right. Like if you look at yourself in the mirror, I mean, there's, especially with the standards that Jesus set for our lives, there's none of us without guilt, right?
Yes.
And what does that look like? What does that mean? I don't know. That's above my pay grade. I'm not God. I think you look at these stories of, it seemed like the people that are the heroes of these stories didn't really concern themselves with some of the big stuff. They're just like, I need to learn how to serve God better, right?
Yeah.
I must decrease so he can increase,
Mm-hmm.
is what Paul taught us, right? Um, uh, so is God still
John
doing
told
divine
us that. Yeah.
justice?
Yeah.
It was John. Oh, sorry.
John the
Um,
Baptist. Mm-hmm.
um, is he doing divine justice? I mean, I would assume yes, on
Yeah.
some level.
Yeah.
It doesn't go where I want it to go. It doesn't go how I see it should go. But I'm not God.
I don't see how he would have divine justice in one case and not continue to bring that forward, uh, since he is the creator of the universe and he is the
Hmm.
only divine judge, the only one capable, of administering divine justice. Nobody else can do it. Only God can do it. And even
Hmm.
Jesus says that, right? But here we have to remember this kind of goes back to our blessings and curses comments that God certainly has blessed David abundantly in ways that that little shepherd boy would never have thought possible. But there's always a consequence if you do something against God's will, right? Always a consequence.
Hmm.
And because they have this special relationship, this unique bond, this unique face to face interaction about things, um, perhaps the consequences are a little more grave, or something we might think is unfair, like Moses didn't get to go into the Holy Land. And, um, you know, the things that happen that make us go, geez, that doesn't seem fair. The guy worked so hard. Now, why this? But yeah, uh, it does show us the seriousness of sin in the eyes of God, though, doesn't it? I mean, he was very remorseful and he was repentant. Um, he was truly repentant, but that doesn't mean that God didn't didn't have a consequence for that sin. There's a consequence even after forgiveness.
Yeah, and that's all of us, right? And then the also the hard thing is, the consequences go far beyond us, right? I mean, think of
Yeah.
David's entire family structure, of David's other wives, of like, how do they feel about David after this, right? That's just not going to be like, oh, he made a mistake. Like, he made a series of mistakes, and the first mistake was not like, oh, I lied in an inopportune situation. Like, he put a lot of pieces in place to make this happen. I doubt everybody that knew viewed him differently after that point, and that damaged everybody forever.
Yeah, I think that, um, he had 8 wives and at least 2 concubines and a bunch of kids, which, as we see, creates drama because of the whole who's going to inherit the kingdom, right? But
Hmm.
I love how God blesses David and Bathsheba by making certain and engineering, that Solomon becomes the king. I mean, there were other choices and there were other people vying for David's kingdom, and many people wanted it. Um, so David ruled for 40 years, and we see a lot of triumph in his ruling and tragedy as well. He expanded Israel's border, he defeated its enemies, he laid the construction or the groundwork for the construction of the temple, which would be built by his son. And by the way, I know that David wanted to. We know that David wanted to build that temple for God. I'm sure it was in his heart. I have the ark, I've got the land, we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and build the thing. And and what does God say to him?
So you have blood on your hands.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of conversation on what that means, you know? Was it the wars? Was it everything, right?
Yeah.
Like, had he not had killed Bathsheba's husband, would that still be the statement? I don't know.
I think according to the text, he's saying, I don't want you to do it because of your warring ways, right? So,
Hmm.
warring, I guess if you're a warrior and you murder one of your own warriors, that could be intrinsic in your nature as a warrior. But mostly he's saying, like, your son is going to usher in this golden age of peace. And this is true. All of the arms get laid down. Israel is a beautiful, thriving nation for decades under Solomon. And I think it's almost like he wants to start fresh. Like,
Yeah.
hey, thanks for your service, but let's do a new thing here. Almost like what happened with Moses saying, you don't get to go in. We're going to start fresh.
Well, and also, I mean, you could clearly say the flood was a version of that too. Like, I need
Yeah,
to start fresh, guys. You know,
yeah.
there's too much here.
It's an interesting idea that this wanting to, it's creation and recreation, creation, recreation, creation, recreation. And we see it here with Solomon. David dies at the age of 70. I mean, he had a good long run. He had a good life, a long relationship. And he left us with a tremendous body of work, right? The Psalms. And we haven't really even talked about David's really sensitive side, his
Right.
poetic side, right?
Yeah, the warrior poet kind of thing.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing because we could picture him being a warrior, but it's a little bit harder to picture him sitting down and penning some of what is the most beautiful language in the Bible.
That's interesting because it's, for me, it's almost reverse. Like, I have a hard time visioning him as a warrior, because how he was described when he took on Goliath, the fact that he would sit in Saul's court and play his little instrument. I think there was one story where David came back and worshiped God and took off his clothes and danced. It's like,
Yeah.
definitely a passionate dude, like deep feeling, and a strong understanding of the world. Still very susceptible, as we all are. And then, yeah, it appears a vicious warrior. I still wonder, was he a tactician? Like, was he just
Mm-hmm.
smarter? Is that how his warrior manifested itself? Because he was never described as like a giant, big, strong dude that was a skilled swordsman. I mean, he took Goliath out with a sling. Maybe he was just super smart, and that's how he won.
I mean, you'd have to be something about his abilities. Well, also, he credited it to the Lord. His
Hmm.
abilities combined with the Lord's favor was what made him so successful. It's not like he didn't have some failures, of course he did. But I guess we could look at it more like, look, he trusted that God was going to be with him, and he let God lead the way. This is a common theme that we're learning. When we let God lead the way, it goes better for us. It certainly goes better for David. It went better for Moses. It went better for Noah. I mean, and Abraham. Just staying out of our own way and letting God show us the way. Yeah. But I do love the fact that he is so sensitive. Maybe a person that sensitive and insightful has got to be brilliant. All of the insight he brings to us about God and our
Hmm.
relationship with God, right? Like, why are you forsaking me? And yet I still love you. I'm suffering, I'm struggling, and yet I will always stand by you. These constant crying out to God, but never leaving God. It's such a remarkable message to us about how we can go to God with our own difficulties, no matter what they are, and even be bordering on berating God, like, why are you letting this happen to me? But then turn around and say, and yet it's your will, not my will. So I love how he
Yeah,
captures that.
Well, I love how relatable that piece is as well, right? Because there's these psalms of "You make me lie down in green pastures," or "You save me," or "You rescue me." Saul
Yeah.
was probably chasing him when he wrote that,
Huh.
right? Like it's interesting to see the story from an archival perspective through um, uh, the narrative we've just gone through, and then also peer a little bit inside of the heart of David, the mind of David, through some of those psalms.
Yeah. Well, you're right. This idea of the heart of David, you know, in Acts, it's written that David is remembered as a man after God's own heart.
Hmm.
So we see a lot of this heart messaging about how God looked in David's heart and saw that this is the man he wanted. He didn't have the same outward appearance as Saul, but it's always about what's in our heart. And then David is pouring his heart out through his music and through his words. Uh, it's a big nod to our emotions around God. I think a big kind of an uncovering of what that means for us. We don't have to be afraid of God and say, "Oh, I can't have a emotive relationship with you." Certainly David did, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting if you kind of look at. I think God made us all individually and uniquely, and has a unique relationship with all of us. But there is these at the same time these templates, or you can kind of see these deeper relationships how they work. You get a little bit of a view of it, and how does that inspire us to pursue that for ourselves, right? There is
Yeah.
a clearly a servant side to all these relationships. Even Jesus is like, I'm your servant, right?
Right.
um, and then there is a honesty, those psalms are very honest, right? We see that through Moses of like, I don't think you want me going back there, right? Like that's not how this works. um, and then you see there's still an honest consequence to their actions, good and bad,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that how do we take that forward in our day, our week, our month, and like, okay, how do I be a servant? How do I have an honest relationship with God? Because God doesn't want me to hide how I feel about things, and that also there may become uh, some harsh realities. So I think our I don't remember if it was the last episode or the previous episode. You're like, I always tell people never to pay for patience, because God will provide a way for you to get more patient, right? So like God will work with us, and it's not going to be
I
easy,
already got
right?
it. I got it in spades. So he already solved that. There's lots of other things to work on. Um,
Yeah.
we're working on you now.
Yes, this is all about me. I know. I know.
No, I think you're right. That's a very good observation about how we need to look at these men and see where there's distinctives and where we're the same. And there's so many ways in which we're the same. Their relationship with God is complex, so is our relationship. Their relationship with God is long enduring, so is our relationship. We have highs and lows with God. We have moments of, absolute brilliance in following his will. We have moments when we completely fail at that. We have moments when we're honoring to him and keep his word, and then we have moments when we sin. And the message is you can sin. Of course, that happens, human nature, ever since the fall, but you must repent, and that doesn't mean the consequences are going to go away. We have to
Right.
deal with the consequences of our sin. Um, I love that because it maybe is a bit of a barrier to keep us from sinning. Perhaps David needed that as a reminder of the consequence of sin for him. Um,
Yeah, he got too far in his own creation of his mind of who and what he was at that moment.
a little abuse of power, which we're all guilty of. Abuse, get a little power, and perhaps you abuse it instead of using it the way God wants us to. But we have done a tremendous job covering the lives of these men and women, and I would say I've learned a great deal, and I'm looking forward. We're going to do one more session where we're going to just talk about them all and what we've learned, a little bit of what we've already been doing. And I hope our listeners will join us for that as we perhaps draw to a close some of the big themes or key takeaways from these reviews of these unbelievable people's lives. The
Absolutely. It's been a great
ordinary
journey.
who
I've learned a
became
ton.
extraordinary. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Ordinary. I just gonna, yeah, it's been a great journey. I've learned a ton from all of this. It's fun seeing, how do I say this? I love the ability to look at stuff just not on a, hey, we're going to just grab something, one little story. We're attempting to look at the totality of it. Still, I mean, we're looking at it through a straw because of just
Oh,
how
yeah.
complex these stories are and how much time, but definitely showing them how they fit together and what is God's grand narrative. And I think it helps clean up some of the thoughts that we can have of two different gods, an Old Testament God and a New Testament God. To like, no, God is consistent. He is what he's always been, and he will always be that.
Amen to that. He is who he is. He is who he was. He is who he will always be. And it's just our job to figure out more of who that is and how we can draw closer to him. So that should be our key takeaway. We've learned a lot about how to draw closer to God in this discussion, and I love that. So thank you, Jeremiah, and look forward to
Thank
talking to
you.
you again soon. All right, take care.
Absolutely. Bye bye.
Bye.